Herzlich willkommen zur nächsten Session von ZEIT für Demokratie. Mein Name ist Sebastian, ich bin stellvertretender Chefredakteur von ZEIT Online. Es ist mir eine große Ehre, meinen Gast für dieses Gespräch begrüßen zu dürfen. Ich spreche heute mit Rasmus Kleis Nielsen. Er ist Direktor des Reuters Instituts for the Study of Journalism und auch Professor for Political Communications an der University of Oxford. Er konzentriert sich in seiner Forschung seit Jahren auf neue Formen der Medien, auf politische Kommunikation und wie Technologie die Gesellschaft und die Medien verändert. Als Direktor des Reuters Instituts ist er auch verantwortlich für den großen Reuters Institute Digital News Report, der jedes Jahr erscheint und der die größte und umfangreichste Studie darstellt zur Mediennutzung weltweit, in zuletzt 49 Ländern. Rasmus ist somit also der perfekte Gesprächspartner für das Thema dieses Gesprächs. Es soll heute gehen um Missinformation und das Vertrauen in die deutschen Medien. Das Gespräch findet auf Englisch statt, so welcome Rasmus Kleis Nielsen in Oxford.
Vielen Dank, Sebastian. It's good to be here.
The topic of this discussion is misinformation and trust in the German media. And the question that I was wondering about in preparing for this session was whether we actually have a serious problem with misinformation in Germany in the public discourse. On the one hand, I feel that we have a very strong pluralistic media landscape. We have public service broadcasting, we have private institutions, we have private TV stations that host amazing candidate debates as happened over the weekend. So all of that seems very healthy, and a lot of people seem to get their information still from what you can call traditional media. Also, I feel that most parties and politicians at least follow some basic rules of decency when it comes to public discourse, so all of that doesn't really seem that bad, especially compared to other countries. Then again, there's that other narrative that we have in Germany that with the rise of Pegida, AfD in recent years, and now the Querdenker, there actually is a lot of misinformation, especially on social media, especially on Telegram groups. And all of that can seem extremely scary, and there seem to be parts of society that are cut off from public discourse and do not trust any longer in traditional media. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, and the question that I hope that we can address today is how big of a problem do you think we have? So if I came up to you in the streets of Oxford these days and asked you, sir, is misinformation a serious threat to German democracy? Would you say, absolutely, you're in big trouble? Or would you say, not yet, but you better watch out? Or would you say, everything's fine, Sebastian, you can calm down, it's just a few Querdenker groups on Telegram?
I'd go for the not yet option. I think several things can be true at the same time. One is that, as you describe it, Germans have inherited a robust democracy and a vibrant and diverse media scene that many Germans still rely upon. At the same time, small minorities, many of them actually enthusiastic media users, but people who don't trust established media very much and feel alienated from the dominant political parties, are also engaged in communities where they share things that are, in some cases, false or misleading, and in other cases are very oppositional to established society. So I would say that Germany is in a relatively privileged position in many ways compared to more fragile democracies around the world, including some that are long-standing, like the United States. But the price of liberty is vigilance, and that comes to our media environment as well as to other preconditions for a well-functioning democracy.
Yeah. To take a step back for a second, I think any discussion of the topic today really has to be grounded on or based on a solid definition of what we actually mean these days by misinformation. It had sort of a rapid rise to prominency over the last 5 years, I feel, but now there are terms being thrown around like misinformation, disinformation. Some people are still talking about fake news, although that's gotten a bit out of fashion recently. What terms do you use, and how would you roughly define them?
I think the starting point has to be the idea that misinformation is false or misleading and potentially harmful. It's not simply that something is not true or would lead people to demonstrably untrue conclusions. this goes for many things we utter in everyday life or we come across, including fiction. It's also that it's potentially harmful. That's misinformation. That's a very broad category. Disinformation, more narrowly, I would say, is intentionally produced for economic gain or to deceive the public. So either for profit or for political purposes normally. Those are the definitions that we arrived at when we worked in something called the high-level group on online disinformation that I was part of, convened by the European Commission. And these definitions have also been embraced by scholars increasingly as a way of trying to get a handle on the challenges that we face in this area. And as you say, rightly, people who are serious about these issues have long since abandoned the misleading and inaccurate term fake news, which I realize is sort of catchy and has a certain sort of appeal to people who prioritize that over precision. Of course, the problem is that the vast majority of misinformation is neither fake nor news. So the term fake news seems unhelpful. It's also a dangerous term because a growing amount of research suggests that by using terms like fake news, people begin to associate problems of misinformation with other problems, such as the perception that some journalism is superficial, sensationalist, and inaccurate, and people start to collapse distinctions between misinformation, broadly speaking, and fake news more narrowly. Now, I want to be very clear about a couple of things that I think are very important to keep in mind when we approach the problems in this fashion. If we define misinformation as false and misleading, potentially harmful, and the subset of disinformation as intentionally produced for economic gain or to deceive the public, then we're dealing with three of the biggest challenges that any journalist or scholar or individual citizen can deal with in assessing any expression or piece of content. We're dealing with the question of veracity. Is this true or false? We're dealing with intent. Why was this expression made? Why did it take the form it did? And we're dealing with consequences. What will come of this expression? So the definition may seem simple, but it's not easy in practice, neither for journalists or fact checkers or scholars or others to work with a definition like that. And we need to recognize that, while there are examples of misinformation that are so clearly and verifiably false, and have such clear stakes that we can confidently conclude that they are harmful, hard cases make bad laws. And I think we need to recognize that much misinformation is necessarily not objective. It relies on what scholars call intersubjectivity, that we have sort of a broad-based agreement in a society that this constitutes misinformation. And that's why metaphors or analogies like pollution or likening misinformation to a disease or a virus are distinctly unhelpful, because of course for both pollution and diseases, science have objective ways of establishing whether something is pollution, whether it is a disease. Misinformation in this sense is more like crime. Scholars like myself can't decide on behalf of society what constitutes crime. But if in a society there is a relatively broad-based agreement on what constitutes crime, and this is encoded in ways that allow us to define it and identify it, then we can start measuring it and addressing it and helping society think about the scale and scope of the problems involved, the causes and consequences, and how one might approach it.
But I guess one of the challenges then is that, as we've seen with Corona, our knowledge of a topic can evolve so quickly that the definition of what constitutes as misinformation in the context of Corona, I guess, has changed dramatically over the last 2 years as we've learned about the effects of masks, for example. I guess that's another challenge. There is no, for all eternity, a definition of what constitutes true or false information.
This is a clear example, and I think it's, that's not that doesn't make it easy to address these problems, but we should, I think, be interested in reality-based responses, not things that seem easy. People who say it's easy to identify misinformation and fake news are amateurs or demagogues and charlatans who don't know what they're talking about. And I think the sort of the most recent example, I suppose, of this quite high-level example of this was the discussion about the still unsubstantiated theory that coronavirus could potentially have been leaked from a lab. which is unsubstantiated, unproven, but was considered so potentially harmful, classified as misinformation. Companies such as Facebook took it upon themselves to remove speculation of this sort. And of course, you know, more recently, the idea has reemerged, and you know, serious scientists and some governments are actively exploring whether this might be true. So the difficulties of doing this instantly, at scale, and in an uncertain situation are very real. And I think we need to confront that the subset of misinformation problems that are easy to deal with or easy to even agree on are a very small part of the issues that we face. And the much wider issues have to do with uncertainty and disagreement.
Yeah. When in preparing for this, I had a look at the Google searches over the last couple of years when people started searching for terms like misinformation, fake news, and the curve really shot up around 2015, 2016. And I honestly can't remember this ever being a topic before then. Where do you think that frame, that narrative of fake news and misinformation suddenly came from? Was it all Trump, and ever since we've been talking about it? Because misinformation must have been around since the founding of the first societies. People have been telling lies or deceiving each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of quite controversial terrain, and different people will have different views on how we should sort of write the history of this. I don't know anyone who would dispute the idea that misinformation is as old as the hills. And that the idea of sort of lying or misleading one another is probably sort of intrinsic to the human condition. I would say that the sort of current explosion of interest in it in the public, some scholars like Jack Bardich in the United States would argue that after the surprise election of Donald Trump in 2016, there was both reason to be concerned that misinformation could have played in part of it, but there was also a set of sort of powerful establishment institutions, including both mainstream media and the Democratic Party, who were looking for reasons and explanations that weren't about them. And in that sense, I think there was both a sort of a reality that we sort of awoke to problems that were very real and had been real for some time and had been inflamed, arguably, by the lack of caution and care among some technology companies, including Facebook and YouTube, in dealing with these issues. But also, if you will, on the demand side, I think there were powerful institutions who were looking for explanations for turmoil that weren't about what I consider to be the fact that many people aren't particularly impressed with the performance of established institutions, whether political parties or mainstream media. And in terms of whether the problems have grown more severe over time, I mean, I think some of them arguably have, and it has been fueled by digital media and social media in particular. But I would also say, I would really caution against sort of romanticizing the past in this respect and papering over that when we look back on the late 20th century and the early 21st century, I think we could sort of credibly classify quite a lot of public discussion around climate change as misinformation in retrospect. I think it's worth remembering that the forever wars in the Middle East and Central Asia were in part based on lies that came from the very top political system in both the US and the UK. And also more broadly, that discrimination and violence and hate against homosexuals, for example, in many societies, or for that matter, racial minorities, have been based on false, vicious ideologies that classified them as either sort of pathological or inferior. And in that sense, much of the 20th century, and for that matter, much before, of course, were demonstrably based on false and misleading information that today we could and should consider misinformation.
But I guess what might have changed are the means or the channels through which misinformation spreads these days, and maybe also the velocity by which they do. The internet making it easier to spread it, but also to put it out there in the world. And there seem to be at least some evidence there that there are new developments like troll factories in Eastern Europe, which leads me to the question of where is it all coming from? What are the sources of misinformation? I've seen you quote, I think maybe a dozen times by now on Twitter, that misinformation comes from the top. So maybe you can say a few words about that. Where is it coming from? Is it industrially produced? Or does it sort of happen by mistake because the average citizen puts out share pics that are simply false?
I think we should sort of look at two different things here. One is sort of platforms and the other one is sources. It's clear that a lot of misinformation, disinformation spreads on the communications platforms that are operated and offered by for-profit private companies in the United States, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp. The larger the user base, the more misinformation you're likely to find, the more sort of libertarian content moderation and the more private or encrypted the communication, the less the company in question will take steps to remove or reduce the information in question. So the platforms clearly are a key part of this. They've allowed the spread of this. Sometimes they've allowed the amplification of it. Sometimes they've allowed people to make money off of it through programmatic advertising, such as Google AdWords and other services. So the platforms are clearly part and parcel of the problem. If we turn to sources then, I mean, of course, there are many different actors that will be spreading false and misleading information, sometimes for profit. Some of this is sort of quite low-grade sort of clickbait, Johnny Depp is dead, sort of celebrity fake news type things that just try to make a bit of money and does so internationally. Some of it is ideological, activist groups of various sorts who have very strong beliefs about things and fight like-minded individuals online. Some of it, of course, is information operations coming from foreign states. I mean, this is documented as well, several of them to the east. But when we look at the sort of volume of things, while I would say we are sadly still in the early days of sort of empirical research in this in many countries across the world, and there's much we still don't know, I would say that the sort of rule of thumb that misinformation often comes from the top is a good starting point. And when we look at work done, for example, in the United States, where arguably these problems have, for a period of time at least, been more pronounced than elsewhere, there is increasing emphasis on how a sort of a feedback loop, if you will, can emerge between some individual prominent politicians, President Trump, some particular media organizations who gladly host quite a lot of sort of opinion material and will sometimes let some of this sort of seep into their news coverage, could be Fox News, and then very active supporters of these politicians, very enthusiastic users of these media, who in turn amplify and spread this information in their own communities, but also to other citizens. So think the far right in the United States. And of course, politicians, media, and activist groups will use social media, Facebook, because that's where lots of people are, YouTube, that's where a lot of people watch videos, WhatsApp, that's something a lot of people use, increasingly Telegram and other alternative platforms that often have very libertarian content moderation practices and are encrypted in ways that further limit the ability to monitor and act against misinformation. And they will use all these platforms, and that's important, but it's also important to understand the sort of feedback loop and the role that what scholars call elite cues often seem to play. And this is not just the United States. Think of Brazil, Bolsonaro, think of some of the examples we've seen from India, for example, and we can, I think of examples within Europe as well.
So, but that sounds like one of the things that might prevent misinformation from originating and spreading is actually it's a matter of political culture. If a politician can make an active choice to sort of use these tactics and fall for them and sort of get election results out of them, or they can say, as I was saying in the introduction, they can say, well, we don't go there simply out of democratic decency, right? That's not a question of platforms, or that's a question of how strong is your democratic culture.
Yeah, I think there is something to that, though, and I would say this is sort of a proud European, but also a proud European who's lived for quite a long time in the United States. That while culture undoubtedly play a role, I would hesitate to put too much weight on that and say that institutions and competition, I think, are at least equally important. And that what we see, I think, often in Europe is that the styles of politics that came to dominate the Republican Party in the United States in recent years and have been sort of embraced by a subset of the American media as sort of uncontroversial and just part of how politics is being done, are also practiced by many far-right populist parties in Europe. It's just that in multi-party democracies, that will get you sort of 10-15% of the votes and a proportional representation in parliament, and then you can sort of sit there and steam.
Yeah.
And on occasion, you will become part of a working majority as a supporting party, or even in government, as we've seen in some of the Nordic countries. But it's extremely unlikely that you will capture executive office the way that Donald Trump did.
Yeah.
So institutions are quite different, and competition. I don't think that politicians are any better or any worse than the rest of us. Maybe I'm naive about that, but I think they respond to incentives. And in that sense, if politicians come to hold the view that you are rewarded for lying to your teeth and it has no consequences, then I suspect that culture will turn out to be quite a weak and thin fence against sort of industrial scale lying.
Yeah, all this sort of gets us to another question that I had about the measurable effects of misinformation. I know you and your institute, you're very much based on empirical research. And if we quickly remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal, at the time that was seen as the decisive factor in helping win Trump the elections. I think we're all a bit ashamed about that assessment 5 years later, when it's not that clear how big an effect it really had. So how much about misinformation can we really measure, both in terms of how much there is, because it's happening in non-private groups, it's happening in spheres that we simply cannot reach with good ways of measuring it, and how much do we actually know about the effects of swaying the election? And you touched on this with the 10-15% just now.
I mean, to understand the impact of any kind of communication, I think we need to start with two things. We need to start with the sort of the media context in which it happens, and we need to start with the individuals that engage with the communication. We'll take the media context first. There isn't comparable empirical research for much of the world, so I'll use a few US examples, but I think it's really, really key to understand and remember that in the United States, where I think we have reason to believe that these problems are more pronounced than they've been in Germany or comparable Western European countries. In terms of sort of overall media use, one estimate suggests that people use about 2 orders of magnitude more news from established media organizations than they come across misinformation from identified sources of quote-unquote fake news. That's about 100 news articles to each piece of misinformation. And that even on social media, where the problems I think are more pronounced, the sharing and reading of news from mainstream sources still outnumber the sharing and reading of demonstrably sort of false or verifiable misinformation sites by a factor of about 20. So that's the first thing, is that, presumably this news from established media will have a greater effect simply through volume than individual pieces of information. That turns to the second one, which is sort of the question of who might then be influenced. I think there is a risk sometimes of what scholars call the third person effect, which is that many of us frankly are susceptible to the idea that while we are reasoned and resourceful individuals with great integrity, everybody else are sort of deluded fools who are easily deceived by advertising, by politicians, by whatever they come across on the internet, whether from media organizations or on Facebook. I am here to tell you that is not so. We are all susceptible and vulnerable to misinformation some of the time. But most of the time, most of us are relatively resilient towards it because many other things influence us more. The people that we care about, who are closest to us, the media that we trust and use on a routine basis, the politicians that we have some confidence in, that we listen to, the experts that we seek out, these things influence us much, much more. Who then might be susceptible? Well, I mean, I would say there are largely sort of 2 factors that so far in the research seem to stand out. One is identity and a sense of group belonging. If people are part of communities that share a belief or share a trust in a particular political figure, they are more likely to trust information that confirms that belief or information from that particular politician. I think we can sort of see in the United States right now that the hesitancy to adopt vaccines or wear a mask amongst many partisan Republicans is sort of a clear example of this role of group identity. The second factor, frankly, is that most of us are busy people. We've got things to do. We've got sort of families we want to spend time with. We've got hobbies. We've got jobs. And frankly, much of the time, we don't spend much time checking the veracity of information that we come across. If it seems good enough, we might act on it. And in that sense, sometimes our own sort of carelessness can be a factor in leading us to share things that on closer inspection we probably shouldn't have shared. And sometimes, of course, also believe things that on closer inspection we shouldn't have believed. So in that sense, sort of identity in particular, partisan identity, and sometimes, frankly, the fact that, we are lazy and we rely on heuristics can lead some of us to be susceptible to misinformation some of the time. But again, I want to stress, we need to understand this in the wider context, and we need to show the same respect to other people that we would expect of them for us. And if you, as a viewer of this program, or perhaps you, Sebastian, individual, believe that you yourself are very susceptible, and seeing something false on Facebook would make you change your life or take a risk with it, then perhaps others too. If you don't hold that view of yourself, I would just encourage you to consider whether perhaps other people are a bit like you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what you're saying is probably very much true, especially in the context of news feeds where you scroll through information very quickly. I mean, the one thing that makes me skeptical, if something seems too good to be true, or an image seems too perfect to capture a new situation, that I sort of, from last years of experience, I learned that that's probably a good indication that this is fake news, right? Do you think media literacy could help? Is there, are you a believer in, teaching, especially young people, more about how they can, safely identify misleading information on the internet, or is that a way too simplistic way to think about it?
I think there is a joke in policy circles that whenever we don't know what to do about a problem, then we wave our hands and say education or innovation, or both. And of course, this has happened with misinformation as well. I'm an educator. I've spent most of my adult life in universities, and I do that because I care about research and about education. And I also think there is a role for media literacy more broadly in our societies. It's probably not the lowest hanging fruit, to be honest. I think the lowest hanging fruit is to recognize what researchers like Edda Humprecht in Zurich have shown, that societies that have media organizations that collectively reach a larger part of the public and enjoy a higher degree of trust from the public are more resilient to misinformation, not because people there are different from people elsewhere, but because they're better equipped to assess the veracity of information they come across, because they more routinely use information from more credible sources. Mm-hmm. That's probably where I'd start, is to think about that. How can we make sure that people have access to and in fact engage with organizations that help them navigate the world in which they live, and also give them the tools to circumvent false and misleading things that they come across? And how do we do that in a way that recognize the reality that the problems here are frankly not primarily amongst younger people. Research in the United States documents that the vast majority of online misinformation is sort of shared and consumed by older white men, essentially, who often are the political right, not
with confidence.
With confidence, yeah. With great confidence. And secondly, recognize that the probably bigger challenge we face than sort of reaching sort of hardcore partisans who may be so committed to a certain view of the world and be such enthusiastic users of not just misinformation but also other information sources, that it isn't about the relative absence of information that they hold the views that they do. It's something that they're committed to, and that in a free society sometimes they have the freedom to choose, even if it turns out to be false and misleading. But that we do have a growing challenge of information inequality in our societies, that a growing minority of the public are not routine users of news media and don't feel that news media serve them particularly well, and are what we in our research at the Institute have called infodemically vulnerable, in the sense that they in moments of doubt don't really have anyone to turn to, because they are not routine users, and they don't have sources they have sort of pre-existing relationships with and trust in, the way that much of the more privileged parts of the population have, who are routine users of established news media. Yeah.
I have to confess that the thing that annoys me most in discussions of misinformation is that people tend to think that the easiest remedy is for Facebook and YouTube to change their algorithm or abolish them entirely, and the world would just be free of any misinformation and the spread of it. that to me seems just a way too simple way to think about it, especially given the fact that when I started studying media science 10, 15 years ago, we sort of praised these platforms for the fact that people could upload information, share it with others, be friends, make connections around the world. It was a great thing. Turned out that people that we don't particularly like started using the same mechanisms, and now we want to abolish those altogether. What role do you think those big tech platforms, Facebook and YouTube in particular, should be playing in combating misinformation?
Well, I mean, I think it's possible at the same time for companies to have a very real culpability and part of the responsibility of the problems that we face, and at the same time to become sort of scapegoats. And it's easy to sort of wave your hands and say sort of make it go away. Of course, the hard part is that these companies are generally subject to two types of criticism at the same time. They must do more and they must also do less, often at the very same time. So if we take the example of Donald Trump, as I said, I think broadly the scholarly consensus would be that he has been a major driver and originator of misinformation in the United States. When Twitter and Facebook, and later on in a more limited way, YouTube, took decisions to limit the president's ability to express himself, this was not just controversial amongst his supporters in the United States. This led to howls of outrage from politicians across the world, including in Germany, I should add, from the reigning government in Germany, who seemed to feel uncomfortable with the idea that private companies had the ability to content moderate and belatedly enforce policies that have been longstanding, even against prominent politicians. So, would that reduce the volume and spread of misinformation? Absolutely, yes. But it was also a hugely controversial decision, and one that I think the companies did not take lightly, and one they've been criticized very, very strongly for. And of course, as a counterpart to the sort of do more discussion, we have to do less discussion. Again, I think it's interesting to look at Germany, which in some ways has been a forerunner for some of these discussions. As I understand it, in Germany, there is sort of a case winding its way through the courts, suggesting what lawyers call the horizontal application of the fundamental right to free expression, that this will apply also on private platforms. This is, I think, a very interesting and potentially quite consequential challenge to the way in which the internet operates today, where in practice in much of the world, these companies are sort of still in part allowed to operate within a sort of an American legal tradition where private companies can do essentially what they want with speech on their platforms because it's theirs. If they don't like nipples because Americans are sort of prudes, then they'll just remove nipples.
What we call Hausrecht.
There's nothing you can do about it.
We call Hausrecht on German websites. Yeah,
it's their decision. But of course, there comes a point where it's possible to argue that these companies have come to, in a practice, serve as sort of a for-profit infrastructure for much of free expression, and that there are fundamental rights that ought to apply or might apply also to expression on these platforms, and that they shouldn't be allowed to remove things simply because they can and simply because they want to. So the sort of the do less argument, I think, is also gaining steam here. Fundamentally, I think the challenge here essentially is a political one. It is who gets to make collectively binding decisions about what you and I and other citizens are allowed to say in public, and how far that is allowed to spread. Right now, the status quo is essentially that within the letter of the law, private companies are making those decisions online, often controversially, always imperfectly, also generally in self-interested ways. They are for-profit companies. And one could make the argument that these decisions ought to be made by elected officials on behalf of the citizens that they represent. So far, elected officials in democracies that I know of have been unwilling or unable, or both, to make these decisions, and they have left the status quo. And I would hope that perhaps we can sort of advance a discussion about whether we ought to make these decisions collectively through the political system. And if we don't, then recognize that that is a decision as well. And that there are many instances in liberal democracies where we decide not to have political rules governing what citizens can and cannot do, because we believe that the rules might be more harmful than the problem they're meant to address.
But I guess it comes back to what we were saying earlier, how quickly misinformation can evolve and what constitutes misinformation. I mean, that decision-making would have to be, in the context of Corona, has to be very quickly. and also Facebook's own board that they called, into existence, sort of independent, honest people making these decisions. You could argue that came way too late. I mean, because the Trump's damage was done by the time that they were having these discussions about whether he should be banned from the platform, right? So I guess that for me...
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's clear that there has been a sort of inexcusable inaction from several of the technology companies, not just Facebook, but also Facebook, most prominent and most importantly Facebook, arguably because it's the largest. But I would not let YouTube off the hook, and I would not let smaller platforms off the hook either. There was too long and a willingness to allow these things to happen, and then sort of first a sort of a spate of unilateral action, and now a search for ways of responding to these things that are not merely efficient, which is important. Does it in fact reduce the spread and scale of misinformation, but also, and I think equally critically, credible? Do people accept them as appropriate for a democratic society, or do they consider this to be sort of opaque forms of censorship encouraged by political elites, nudge nudge, wink wink, sending signals to private companies what you can and cannot say? I think we have enough sort of skepticism towards this sort of quote unquote establishment in Western societies that I don't think we need to supercharge that further by creating opaque backdoors where politicians can tell private companies what citizens are and aren't allowed to say online without clear legal rules that establish what you can and cannot say, who gets to decide, and what the process for appeals are.
The title of this conversation promised that we would also talk a bit about trust in German media, and there's no one better in the world who knows about levels of trust and where people get their news from. So when you look at the data from your digital news report, where do people get their news from in 2021?
I mean, Germany, I think, is an interesting example, as you alluded to at the beginning, Sebastian. In many ways, comparatively, Germany has sort of one of the more impressive media systems in the Western world. It's diverse in terms of the sort of different political orientations. It's diverse in terms of having both sort of upmarket titles and more popular titles. It has a strong local foundation with local newspapers. And in addition to commercial broadcasters, of course, there are strong public service broadcasters as well. So that, combined with the fact that in a comparative perspective, while it may not always feel so for journalists and editors in Germany, the trust in news in Germany is generally quite high, apart from on the far right and some parts of the right. In many ways, things are about as good as one could hope for right now in Germany. What I would say is sort of that the challenges ahead are, I think, quite clear. One is that it's pretty clear that increasingly there are sort of two Germanys in terms of how people engage with information. An older Germany that primarily relies on television and the online sort of spin-offs of established media organizations. They rely on ARD, they rely on RTL, they rely on Bild, maybe in print still. They rely on their local paper, Westdeutsche, Münchner Merkur, whatever it might be. And then a younger generation that is getting its information online. And I think from the point of view of sort of cohesion and a shared universe of facts-based political argument and disagreements on, it might surprise and perhaps even encourage people to be told that they, younger people in Germany use titles such as Spiegel or Süddeutsche, or for that matter, ZEIT, more than their older citizens do. But of course, they also use Instagram and YouTube and Twitter a lot more as a source of news. So it's a very different sort of information ecology from that of their older citizens. And what sort of falls through the cracks on both sides, in particular amongst younger people, is ensuring that people who are less privileged than the majority, lower levels of formal education, lower levels of income, sometimes ethnic minorities or migrant backgrounds, that they feel equally catered to. And right now, I think that's very clearly a challenge that in Germany, as in many other Western democracies, information inequality is increasing and is growing in ways that reinforce existing structural inequalities around education, around income, and race and ethnic identity.
Does that become more of a problem as more and more German news websites put up paywalls and get more restrictive about what people can read and how much they have to pay for it?
It might compound the problem, but I would say that the challenge that many media organizations face online is far more profound than convincing people to pay. It's convincing people to pay attention. According to our research, the majority of German internet users have not used any online news sites in the last week. That's not because they can't.
So we need to...
It's because they don't.
I have to go back to work now and change that, I guess.
I mean, different publishers have different priorities and different missions, and we need to recognize no one publisher can or ought to try solve every problem. I mean, ZEIT is an upmarket title. I mean, that is what it is. But I do think that it's important here to recognize sort of the proud tradition in European publishing of popular titles with the many complications and controversies that surround them. You know, I remember a novel about that from some years ago. Of local titles as community institutions, and of public service media, which in many European countries are being boxed in and sort of politically forced to stay in the past of broadcasting. And that's a political decision, but we shouldn't be blind about the consequences. If we want journalism to serve the whole public in the future too, it's not about people like you and I. We are well taken care of, if I may say so. It's about the people who historically have relied on popular newspapers, on public service broadcasting, and on local papers, and ensuring that journalism as a profession and the news media as an industry continues to serve those people as well, even though that might be less economically lucrative.
Those people in your research who say they don't trust the news, what do they mean by that? I mean, they don't have to be necessarily all Querdenker. I mean, quite the opposite. What leads them to say, no, I don't trust the news? Is it also something like healthy skepticism sometimes, that, you know, they learn to just question information, and it might be socially desirable not to simply trust everything you see on the internet?
I point to sort of two sort of very different kinds of low trust or even distrust in the news media that I think sometimes we risk conflating or just focusing on one of them without recognizing the other one. The most visible is the sort of vocal distrust. This often comes from partisan communities, the sort of very engaged citizens who often consume a lot of news, even though they say they don't trust it, and who often express a distrust towards the media in part because they feel that the media don't respect the views that they have, the politicians that they trust, the priorities they have for society. This could be around migration, for example, on the far right. But of course, historically, it's also been the left who felt that the media were sort of essentially sort of capitalist loudspeakers who were sort of just propping up a bourgeois hegemony. This is sort of a very sort of ideological form of distrust. And it's up to each of us to sort of pass judgment on whether we think it's reasonable or not. You know, there are people who would say that, you know, maybe it is all, you know, Systemmedien, I think the term is in Germany. There are scholars who make such arguments, Noam Chomsky, most prominently amongst them. But this is sort of, I think, the most visible form of distrust, the ones that journalists and editors experience almost daily on social media and can see it. We need to, I think, to remember that there is arguably in many countries a larger part of the people who have not distrust, but low trust in news media. That's much more about a lack of familiarity. And simply because of that lack of familiarity, a limited sort of recognition of whether there might perhaps be a difference between sort of a reported story from DPA or a media organization and just stuff on the internet. Because if you haven't sort of grown up using it, and if you don't have sort of routine use that will, you know, confront you with the limitations, but also perhaps demonstrate the value, like how would you come to build trust over time? There may be a similar saying in German, but in English it's often said that trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. But of course, when it comes to news and media, if people are not routine users of news media, how would they build that trust? And in that sense, I think the challenge for that part of the public is not sort of ideological opposition or active distrust of the news media. It's indifference. And I think there the media organizations face a growing challenge in that, in particular in the future, you know, I'm probably the last generation who will have sort of grown up knowing what media my parents consumed. Whereas now increasingly children would simply see their parents looking at things like this, but they won't know what they're looking at. And in that sense, the sort of the socialization that media are part of your life, and certain newspapers are things you read in the morning and certain TV programs are things you see in the evening, is essentially evaporating. And I think we are at very real risk of losing some of the sort of habitual social and cultural underpinnings that enable journalism. And in that sense, sort of, if media organizations and journalists, and frankly, no one else care about this or will take on this challenge, if journalists and news organizations don't confront that risk proactively and try to do something about it, I think we will see, or at least see the risk of news and journalism retreating into the kind of role played by high culture, classical music, jazz, modern art and contemporary arts and the like, of being very, very good at serving the needs of a small minority of people who are very actively engaged with it, while being regarded with puzzled indifference by much of the rest of the public. And it's up to journalists and news organizations to decide whether they are happy with that sort of high culture scenario, or whether they believe that journalism and news is for everybody, and not just for the privileged.
Great. Rasmus, we're almost at the end of our time here. I do want to come back to the first question that we ask: is misinformation a serious threat to German democracy? I think we covered a lot of different angles of that. Is there anything you want to say in summary? Anything that we missed?
It's always challenging, I think, as a researcher, when you sort of dedicate your life to studying something, and often you find yourself having to say, well, my professional judgment of the best available research is that this problem is less severe than many people assume. It sounds like you're sort of belittling, something in the world or your own area of analysis. But I would say, I think it can be true at the same time that while misinformation is not a problem of the scale and scope of, say, climate change or, Europe's new position in geopolitics, or the question of how we live together in a sort of tolerant and equitable way in changing societies, it can be a serious issue nonetheless, one we ought to understand, each of us as citizens, one we ought to sort of form a view on, and one where we all have a responsibility to judge the powerful and the institutions around us, and whether they are in fact taking this issue seriously and doing something about it. Platforms have fallen short. Perhaps news media have some things to do as well. Politicians, in some cases, have been part of the problem, not part of the solution. But also to think about each of us as a citizen. We have inherited a democracy that withstood the twin challenges of sort of totalitarian fascism and totalitarian communism in the 20th century. We're not descendants of fearful men and women. We each of us have a responsibility to sort of take that upon ourselves and think about what is our role in taking this forward and making sure that we renew that democracy that we have from yesterday, and make sure that it thrives tomorrow as well.
Rasmus, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show and the program today. Greetings to Oxford, and I hope you see you again soon. Have a good day.
Thank you very much for having me.